Now, last week I had talked about that I had a slide for the Son of David. I finally found it at the end of my PowerPoint on me. So here it is, the Son of David. The idea of Jesus as the Son of David is going to play into him as the Messiah, because going back to, I think, our first study, I mentioned that not only was Jesus called Messiah, but so was David and a few other folks. So this is all the way back to David, going back beyond that, that he be known as a son of David. To get into the fact there is a prophecy concerning David and his real line. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, there's a prophecy concerning David. It goes like this: when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I up your offspring after you, who shall your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I am him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. My love as I saw from before. Oh, to some extent, some people did think this applied a little bit to Solomon, because it's about building his house. And of course, Solomon is famous for building the temple, which David wanted to build, but David wasn't allowed to build because God said he didn't want a man whose hands were covered with blood to build his house. Interesting, as it would turn out, the house of the Lord, the dwelling place of the Lord, would be built with bloody hands, namely his own bloody hands. It's interesting that this distinction was made, but there is prophecy concerning the line of David, and that he was going to become a king, a ruler, whose kingdom would never end, and he would be the Messiah. So it's a view that he makes this distinction and makes it early on, come to mind all these various things that the people are going to be thinking about, and this is what the story really is. And as a part of that, David does try to make a case really early on, and into part of that in the discussion of the genealogy. Into the genealogies, my genealogy is starting in verse 2. It has taken us now to the third to actually get to the second verse of Matthew. This bodes well for the length of our class, but hey, some fun in the meantime and get into a lot of good stuff. So, for immediate purposes, we're in Matthew chapter 1, verse 2, and since we're going to be covering the whole genealogy pretty much at once, verse 2 through 17. Not really going to get into the individual names so much, so if you have some questions about individual names, don't hesitate to ask. So, interestingly enough, we have genealogy that starts with Abraham. Now, as we're genealogies, it's important to understand that the genealogies with the Old Testament kind of genealogies, and does reflect the Old Testament genealogy. They're really trying to give us the ancestral line, the family tree. They're to do with their genealogy is going to determine who's on genealogy. And this is important to remember because there's other genealogy of Jesus, and we're going to get into that just a little, even though I said for the most part we're going to take Matthew by himself. You really can't talk Matthew's genealogy without talking Luke's genealogy. There are some incredible differences between the two. So, and those differences, we got to acknowledge them to some extent. Otherwise, we won't be doing justice even to me. So, and roles that's going to be important to remember when we're talking those differences, because we got a different purpose for his genealogy than Matthew. So it's important these distinctions as we're getting into this genealogy. So genealogies are going to play a lot of different roles depending on the kind of literature, what the author wants to say, all that kind of good stuff. So questions we're going to be asking ourselves as we get into this genealogy is, what is Matthew trying to convey with his genealogy? A good question. And the beginning part of that is that, well, establish that Jesus is a son of Abraham. He is the fruition of that promise given to Abraham that his seed would be a blessing to nations. And Jesus is that fulfillment. Is going to be starting here with Abraham. On the other hand, Luke is actually going to start with Adam. So interesting in that regard. So, Matthew, we're starting with Abraham, and now take genealogy into three distinct, each 14 generations. So we've got this kind of group going on. And highly suggestive from a Jewish mindset, the idea of order suggests divine intervention. Remember, in their ideas represented the destruction of creation. It represented the sin, basically. The opposite of sin would be order, and God is the opposite of sin, as he is holy and perfect. So that would indicate God would be nice and orderly. So this idea of 3 sets of 14, we have an orderly. And one of the Matthew's probably trying to bring out genealogy is active. This is time as a goal. And what we're seeing in Matthew's genealogy is that he is drawing out the history of Israel and moving to this goal. From the promise to Abraham, that Abraham would become a great nation. That he was a nation. All ethnicities. interpretation of touch. These three analyses, geology, but we have 14 generations here for this time period, 14 generations here, and then we have 14 more here. That's very, very sort of very selection of impact. It is interesting to note who is in the genealogy. The will we Dave? That is one of the border points. Okay, most things you heard clearly. We're not at those times. Better now. Yeah, according later to with the new microphone here in the next couple of days. So, all right, let's hope this clears up a bit and doesn't last much longer. Okay, we're better. Okay, so with the genealogy, we're picking up the idea of because well, Matt highlights the fact David sinned, and so we're picking up on that. He's going to reinforce it again with the next generational break, but the next generational break is set around the exile into Babylon. And for those familiar with the Old Testament, the bad activity was because Israel was unfaithful, not do their jobs. They were chasing after gods of their foreign wives. People not doing much better. They're continually being lured into worshiping Baal, the Canaanite god. And the Canaanites were, of course, people who lived in the region, and they had all sorts of weird and in the interest of keeping this on the PG to G side of things, we won't go into that. If you're interested in getting some more insights into those, feel free to ask me offline. But so anyhow, the is bringing out this idea of Israel's faithfulness and God's faithfulness. Matthew is of the people that in history, by means of his very orderly, very even genealogy, God is active, that it is his plan from the beginning, that he is working constantly through history, and he has this goal in mind, and that particular goal is, of course, Jesus. We're seeing this come out in his theology. So we're also seeing ties in with the Old Testament, one through Abraham, and two also the 14 generations closely resembles a gene found in First Chronicles, chapter 2. Check that out on your own. So this is mostly source for the whole 14 generations. So if you're asking that question, why did he pick 14 generations? It's really because he was going off of First Chronicles, which do the clean line. So, which is all playing into what's happening here, and we'll count as we talk about the two different genealogies for Jesus. I want to point out is we get to Mary. There's a huge grammatical difference between Mary and the other ladies who are mentioned in the genealogy. We get to Mary from an active voice of the verb, which suggests that the person is actively involved in doing the action, a passive voice, which suggests that this is an action happening to the person. So where here. In the one, they I mean, her after, but we get married. It's different. I mean, this is happening to Mary. So she got involved in the begetting of Jesus, the complete work of the Holy Spirit. So grammatical means conveying this is still God's work. Even if a human is involved, God is still doing all the work. That the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born. Joseph is his daddy. Is who raised him, physically speaking, and probably taught him his trade, most likely involved in his Torah. But Joseph isn't, to use the modern terminology, the baby daddy, the father. And to what Matthew is using his genealogy to do. He's using his genealogy to show that this is God active, this is God working, this is God doing his thing. This isn't just your happenstance. Everything from the very beginning to the very climax and beyond that is God's plan. This is his work. This is his intervention in history. Trying to do with his genealogy. Would really play in closely to how we answer this question: what is genealogy? The genealogy appears in Luke chapter 3, verses 23 to 38, and is really different from the genealogy that Matthew presents. There's correspondence, but at the time there's some pretty major differences, including who is named as Joseph's dad. Different, each with their strengths, each with their weaknesses, and the one I am going to go with for the purpose of this class, yes, it's got its strengths, got its weaknesses, is this one that draws all of them and puts them together. Quite likely with Luke's focus on Mary for the birth narrative, that Luke drawing a biological ancestry. And not necessarily through Mary, but it likely is. Matthew, on the other hand, is doing the royal line. Lineage doesn't necessarily happen via biological means, so to speak. There's evidence that is used for this. It is begotten or begat, or the of. Sometimes it's translated of, depending on how translating philosophy is. That also be used and possible that some of the differences in the names and because people of the royal lineage adopted members into the royal family. And so what we are seeing possibly in Matthew, and this could explain the differences, is Matthew lists the adoptive brothers from the royal line. This is true. Your guess is probably as good as mine, because, well, nobody ever bothers to explain it, at least in a sense, so to speak. All trust that, the Holy Spirit knows what he's talking about. So, possible solution to the idea of the two genealogies is that we're seeing in Matthew the royal line, in Luke we're seeing a biological ancestry. So we have it that there's something going on, just those lines. It is also important to remember there were specific rules for family lines in the Jewish nation, going back to the Old Testament, where they to continue the family line, such things could happen. If his husband died, his brother would take over the family obligations to provide male heirs and children through her, which serves the purpose of taking care of the widow and at the same time continuing the family line. And there is evidence of that happened. The child was listed under the first husband's name. The biological ancestries would include even though the child was fathered by the husband's brother. That happened. Hopefully it's all making sense. The whirlwind tour of the genealogy of Jesus. Now, talk Jesus' life. A minute to enjoy the comic. Sometimes what can happen in your dreams. Play an important part in this next section. All right. So, Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. We're going to take those as a chunk. Matthew here reiterates the idea of the genesis of Jesus. So that first verse, that first sentence, it goes, "No, the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way." It does read, "No, the genesis of Jesus, the Christ, took place in this manner." So we're reiterating what happened in the first verse with the idea of the genesis of Jesus, the beginning of Jesus. So we're and moving towards God's goal. Giving the passage. So back into the gist of Jesus. And see that God is going to be playing against human misunderstandings. And we're pretty obvious one happened right away. with poor Joseph. You got to feel for the poor guy. And the young lady wants to spend the rest of his life with her, and before they to consummate, she's pregnant. Yeah, you got what was going through his head at that time. But it is a capstone that really drove home the genealogy thing, that God